Welcome to Epsilon Theory Shorts. Today's video comes from the Ask Me Anything with Ben Hunt and his guest, Dave Nadig. The question is, what are the differences between an ETF and a mutual fund, especially tax differences, and how tightly they're tied to indexes?
So let me tease that out in a couple ways.
Yeah.
First, the distinction between vehicle type. So ETF versus mutual fund versus closed-end fund versus doing it yourself.
Good.
The ETF has a couple of just built-in features that are convenient for most investors. The obvious one are the first two letters, exchange traded, so you can sell it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You don't have to wait till 4 o'clock
Yep.
NAV. That's the big one. The tax advantages.
Sorry, did everyone get that right? So for a mutual fund, you can sell it during the day, but you
get 4.
You get the 4 p.m. price.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you really want out at 9:30, you got to wait all day and
Yep.
see whether you got out at a price you liked.
Yep.
There's nothing you can do about that. With an ETF, you at least know the price. You may not like it, but you get to choose whether or not they hit the buy or sell button. The tax advantage comes in largely from that creation redemption process because most importantly on a redemption, the AP receives a basket of securities. It's not a sale. It's an in-kind. So there's long settled tax law in the Supreme Court going back 75 years. That is not a sale. There can be no recognizable economic event. So when they push those shares of Apple out that they don't want, what do? They pick the shares of Apple that would have the highest tax overhang on them.
Right.
So they're constantly every ETF is constantly washing out any tax gain overhang they might have based on redemptions. To the point where some funds, and this is where it gets a little bit ethically questionable, will sort of engender those trades on a regular basis with market participants specifically to wash those things
for the
out.
tax advantages.
Right, they're called so-called heartbeat trading, which my friend Elizabeth Kastner at FactSet's been covering for a decade now. Wow. You know, every quarter, for instance, you'll see a bunch of Vanguard funds have a giant redemption and then a giant creation 3 days later, and everybody's like, what? Vanguard struck a deal with somebody to basically warehouse that risk for a certain period of time. Generally, what you'll see is a creation and then a redemption because it's easier to get money in and out as opposed to get somebody to sell and then give it back to you.
Yep.
And what that just has this effect of constantly resetting the basis higher and higher and higher and higher. So consequently, most equity ETFs that have been around for 10 years have enormous tax loss overhangs because they're constantly resetting their basis higher and higher and higher, and eventually things go down. 2022, all of a sudden everybody was like, oh great, I got all these losses I can
And you
use.
can harvest it then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that advantage accrues to ETF investors by effectively just never giving you a capital gains distribution. It's not like a rule or anything like that, but just the way it works, it's very unlikely that anything but a super high turnover fund is going to ever give you a capital gains distribution. Where we see it tends to be actually in bonds, oddly, because if you're in a 7 to 10 year treasury fund, well, if nobody's redeeming on the day that the 7-year becomes 6 years, 11 months, you got to sell something. And if you sell it at a premium, you're going to have to book that gain. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely better than mutual funds, where in mutual funds, you decide to take your money out, the portfolio manager has to go sell a bunch of stuff. They'll do their best, but ultimately that's going to accrue to everybody who's left in the fund.
Who's left in the fund.
And it's not like lost money, but it's lost timing. You're going to have to pay the capital gains this year when you might not have wanted to for 20 years.
Yeah, Travis raises a good point. You know, that advantage is so great, right? What's the ratio between ETFs and mutual funds that are out there? Because we were talking earlier, for a while you thought, ETFs are going to swallow the market.
Yeah, I did for a long time. Right now we're sitting at about 8.1 trillion in ETFs and about 20-ish in mutual funds.
So like almost 3 to 1.
Almost 3 to 1
in mutual funds.
But importantly, that changed a lot over the last 4 or 5 years because going into the pandemic, I still had in my charts 2026 as sort of the crossover year, like when would one be more than the other? The ETFs would catch up. What happened was the pandemic, and the pandemic just flushed money into money market funds.
Right.
And that money is very sticky. And it's slowly getting into ETFs. Now we're seeing that money start to dribble into the ETF flows. The story of, like, in any given asset class, ETFs have generally been winning. So active equity ETFs, active equity mutual funds have been in net redemptions for 20 years. Like they have not had a positive inflow year since I've been in this
Forever.
business, really.
Right.
Last year was a billion change that just came out of active equity mutual funds, all went into ETFs, right? Big year for active equity ETFs. So that the flow is definitely going that way, but this bubble of money that came in and a couple of great years in markets, right? They started with more, so they're up a little bit higher there as well. And also mutual funds are still the default vehicle for 401k investors, and that's not really going to change anytime soon. There's no reason to put an ETF in a 401k plan.